All right, Andy, I'm so glad you could join me, especially with, as I know, how you seem to be constantly busy with new scores.
That's a pleasure, man. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, I mean, like I said, you had messaged me, sent me some emails about some of the scores that you're working on, and the turnaround times you've had, where some
Yeah.
you've had them written, recorded, delivered in 2 weeks, is absolutely unreal.
Well, it's not some. It's been all of them. All of them have been in in that period of time.
I mean,
So yeah,
so. Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
So I was gonna say, I mean, this is in one sense an overly broad question, but
Mhm.
how do you do that much music? 30, 40 minutes of music in that short period.
Well, okay, that's a good question, and it is quite a broad question. I the way I see it, I have to do the same job that any composer has to do. I just have to do it in a particularly condensed period of time. So the way it would usually work is I'll receive the edit, like what will be called the lock, and I just have to kind of I just go at it. So first thing I'll do is I'll watch the film. There may be some temp on there. And then what I tend to do is I'll watch the film and take notes. And basically, because this has all happened in the last 18 months, most of these films. So there's been no opportunity for spotting sessions or anything like that. So I would do that myself and spot the film like on my own, take a lot of notes, and then just kind of have to start work. Um, so what I generally do is on day one, I'll create a sound palette. And whilst I'm taking notes and spotting the film, I will identify some sounds or some particular emotions or some character beats that I know I want to hit when I get to that point of the film. And that will start to give me some sonic ideas, that kind of thing. Um, but usually, I mean, on a bigger movie, I mean, 2 weeks would probably be the amount of time you would spend creating samples and getting your sounds organized and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I have to do that pretty much in a day. So what I the first film I did, a film called Hatched. I spent a day putting some sounds together and creating some sounds for uh, if for people who don't know, there are dinosaurs in that film. So I was creating sounds that would work with the dinosaurs, but there was very much a human story as well. So it was quite a broad palette I had to create in a short period of time. And then I could start putting that to picture. What I have learned through the process is that sometimes when you're pushed for time, the best thing to do is actually just start work. I've done the research, I've watched the film, I've taken my notes, and then just work with a scene and start to like paint pictures, my own sonic pictures that work with the dynamic of the film. Now, the reason that can be sort of difficult in terms of creating a palette is like all these films seem to have a cold opening. So there's no title sequence, because with a title sequence, you can kind of set up your stall. Here's maybe a motif, here's a theme, that kind of thing. I don't have that opportunity with a cold opening. We're straight into some kind of action that may or may not be related to how the narrative of the film plays out. So the best thing you can do is start to work with that initial scene and create a score which is dynamic and is malleable as well, because a film has lots of peaks and troughs, and it has to be dynamic, and you need to have some tools at your disposal where you can apply them to scenes where it's underscore or there's a lot of action. And the films that I've worked on, which have been mostly in horror, have a lot of both of those extremes. So it's being as versatile as possible in as short a time as possible. And I don't know, this might be interesting to other composers out there as well. The way I tend to go at these is to work chronologically, because if you've spotted a film with directors and producers and editors, that kind of thing, there might be a few key scenes where a lot of themes will kind of hinge on that hub, and you work from there, and you can work backwards and find with other kind of emotional beats from there. But because of the time crush, I will score the film chronologically, and that has its good points and it has its bad points. Sometimes the bad points, I have found that I've got to a point where I've needed to go back because the sound and has evolved and has grown, but where I was at the start of the film might not be fleshed out enough. So again, within that very short period of time, I've looked at some of the work, had a bit of a critique and thought, okay, well, just sonically from a mixed point of view, some of those early scenes just need to be brought up to the level where we are now. But also, if you're working chronologically, that can be really cool, as you're kind of discovering the music is because you're writing in not in real time, but as the story unfolds, the music is discovering the characters as they're going through their journeys as well, rather than I have this piece of music which describes where this character is going to be, and I need to put that jigsaw puzzle together by the time we get there. I'm kind of building the jigsaw without knowing what the picture will be at the end, if you know what I mean. And that's really exciting as a composer to kind of work through that process, and it can be really satisfying as well.
Well, that's kind of like how writing a script is as well. You know, you might
Exactly.
you'll have some broader ideas and maybe a treatment or an outline, and then as you write, or it's the same writing a short story or a novel, etc., where you start writing and then maybe for a script, when you get 60, 80 pages in, you realize the characters have evolved, and then, or the plot has evolved, or it's going to a place that you didn't expect, and then you have to go back to the beginning and start working those in. So, I mean, it makes sense. It's interesting, and I imagine that similar things happen if instead you start on those particular scenes, like you mentioned, where a lot of things hinge on. But you know, when you first worked on Hatch, I think you may have done, I don't know, one or two shorts beforehand. So was that, I mean, and obviously you'd done years of making music prior, but obviously that's kind of a different beast when you're doing it for yourself. So when you got to Hatched and realized you had 2 weeks, were you, like, was it a daunting feeling where you sat there and said, oh shit, how am I going to do this? Or did you go, I've just got to get cracking, and went nose down and dove right into it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, just as a bit of background, you're right, I had done some shorts, and I think other composers will have similar experiences where you do a lot of shorts and some of them are never finished, but you still have the experience of composing on those projects. I was lucky to work on a really good short with a director that went and did straight after that TV special for Network here in the UK, with a really big production company as well. So I was taken on that part of the journey also. But I've been doing a lot of commercials, and I've been doing a lot of production music. And those, they're very different platforms, but they definitely give you a lot of tools for approaching narrative. But beyond that, Nick, I mean, I've just been a fan of film my whole life, and I've been kind of reverse engineering scenes and movies and picking things apart critically or internally for such a long time. But when I got the call about Hatched, I was actually offered a different film by the same company, that they had two ready to go. And they kind of laid it out in the email how long it would be. You've got 2 weeks, it's this amount of money to do this film. And I did think exactly what you thought I would think. But what I did what I always do when I need to process something. And I'm just going to go for a walk. And I was literally out for 45 minutes, just like, this is going to be a huge mountain to climb in a short period of time. Came back, replied to the email and said, I'll do it. And they wrote back and they were like, well, that film's actually gone, but we have this other film, this dinosaur movie. Do you want to do it? And I was like, yeah, sure, let's go. And so I got the film the next day, and we were kind of off to the races at that point.
That's great. I mean, I don't know if everyone would do that. I mean, that's, like you said, that's a tough mountain to climb. You look at that and go, wow, that's tough. But
yeah, but I mean, I guess with working on production music, because the first production music album I had done had been with Sony, so it was kind of, it was Premier League stuff straight away. and you have to write a huge amount of music, usually on a brief, in a short period of time. And then with shorts, it's you're working on a smaller amount of visual information, but you do have to throw a lot of music at it. So if you couple that with just being such a fan of films and score and that kind of thing, it was I found myself acclimating to that climate really easily, the same way I had done with commercials. So when you're asked to do something, and you're given certain parameters to do it, my first thought was, how can I do this? Like, rather than I don't want to do this, or I don't think this is possible, it was more like, how can I do this, and how can I do this really well? So after I'd done the cold opening and we were in a good space with how it was sounding and how that, because it was quite a long sequence, about 5.5 minutes, how that had evolved, I sort of mapped out and thought, well, okay, I've got to do about 7.5 minutes, 8 minutes per day. And then that was my working target. So it's just about putting in the hours and really kind of trying to achieve those benchmarks as you go through the process. And I don't know, you also, you build up a momentum as well. You build up quite a head of steam because it has to be done. And people are relying on you. And at the end of the day, I mean, I really enjoy the work. So, I mean, I guess sometimes it would be great to kind of sit and process and unpack and like a single cue for 3 weeks. And those situations do happen, and I'm sure they're going to happen to me at some point. But there's also, it's a different thought process, but it's equally satisfying just to kind of plow into something and link all those pieces together in a really condensed time frame. I mean, I guess it's like working on TV as well, because you have the development phase and then you're kind of getting an episode a week. I didn't have any of the development phase. It was just, okay, like we're doing a film and it starts tomorrow, let's go. And for Hatched, I wrote about 80 minutes of music, because these things are, I mean, they like them to be not wall to wall, but I kind of argue sometimes there has to be breathing room. We have to let the actors do some of the work, because if the score's never ending, the score doesn't do anything. If from, apart from perhaps Star Wars, if the score starts at beat 0 and finishes at the end of the credits and is wall to wall all the way through, unless it's like an animated picture or Star Wars, it just, I think it gets pushed so far to the back of your subconscious when you're watching the film, that I think you need beats, you need breaks, you need dynamics, you need those places where it's dialogue that's doing the work. I mean, dialogue's always king anyway, or queen, but you have to have those moments where the music pauses, because then when it comes back, it's doing something new. It's elevating the next, hopefully elevating the next part of the film.
Well, and like you said, if it's always there, it's as if it's not there at all.
Exactly.
It fades into the background. I was thinking that I was watching Dune last night, and unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to finish it. But I thought that at first too, where I was like, wow, this is just wall to wall pounding music, and then 25, 30 minutes in, you get a scene where it just goes away, and then suddenly the film becomes really, really intimate, and then you zoom back out, the score picks up again, and having that changing dynamic nature. I mean, and it's not for every film, but for a lot of films that it makes everything much more impactful. But as you're talking about the timing, I started thinking like, oh, you know what? I think Jerry Goldsmith did Chinatown in like 10 days. And
that's right, yeah.
And I think James Newton Howard, when he came in and did a cleanup job on King Kong after Howard Shore left, and I think that was like 2 or 3 weeks, and so started to think like, yeah, it's tight, but I think sometimes it makes it so you're not overthinking it, that you're going for your first impulse, and a lot of times that first impulse, that gut feeling is, I mean, maybe it's not perfect, but what is. But it works, and when you don't have the opportunity to overthink it and tinker too much, and then decide to go a different way, like sometimes that's what you need.
Yeah, I think there is an element of what could be described as overthinking. There's also on films with bigger budgets, there's more departments that will have a stake in the score.
Hmm.
There'll be more people giving notes. There'll be just a longer process of back and forth. These films that I've worked on they've been independent films, so the crews are fairly small. And I generally will work with one or two producers and the director. And it's also, I mean, it's very efficient. It's compartmentalized. So I will have my 2 weeks, and then I have to deliver the score to whoever's going to be dubbing the film. And at the same time, there is grades going on. And then for a film like Hatched, which is quite VFX heavy, that whole process is sort of ticking over in some other part of the country as well. Actually, it was. I mean, I had these 2 weeks to do that film, but it was in post production for so long because there was VFX that were going back and forth, back and forth. But that was nothing to do with me. But the point is, I mean, you still have to write and mix and orchestrate. And Hatched was kind of strange, not strange, but it was adventure horror, which is sort of a new genre to me, because it has killings and that kind of stuff in like horrors do, but you're talking about dinosaurs and this kind of stuff, so you have to kind of like paint a picture which describes all these elements. So there was a lot of drums, there was a lot of strings, but there was also this kind of sadness behind it. It was motivated by grief, so I had to kind of I had to absolutely work that into the score as well. So that all has to be done and mixed and then exported and delivered and sent on to the next department. And then my work there is done, usually.
And so a lot of these, like you mentioned earlier, like, inhabit this horror space. But like as any even casual fan of horror knows, like it is a broad genre. There are all sorts of subgenres and little areas you can inhabit. So I know, and sometimes that goes into the music as well. So like one upcoming one you have is Easter Killing, that as far as scores go was your first opportunity to do basically wall to wall synth. And then other ones like Jack and Jill was a little more folk horror-y. Spider in the Attic was a bit more of a cosmic horror. So I mean, have you enjoyed kind of having the opportunity to jump around musical genres and these horror subgenres in, gosh, just in the last 18 months?
Yeah, I love it, to be honest. These films have a lot of layers. I'm a huge horror fan and a huge fan of genre film in general. And as you say, like horror is such a broad church. And from the first film, which was adventure horror, then onto Prototype, which, even though it isn't out yet, was the film that followed on from that in terms of my work. That was science fiction, but it was pretty much a film about a dysfunctional family. So all these films have these very different heartbeats to what you might expect from a horror movie. So, I mean, you mentioned Jack and Jill, which is very much a folk horror because it's based on the nursery rhyme of Jack and Jill, and the main characters. Well, the main characters aren't even Jack and Jill, really. They're stalking basically and protecting their environment. But at the heart of that film is it's a film about loss, and it's a film about grief, and it touches on some really delicate subjects. So as a composer, there's a lot to latch onto to find an emotional heart, rather than just making people feel uneasy or scared or working up to the big boom. I never approach the film from like that point of view. I'm looking at the emotional beats of the characters, because I've been lucky enough to work on films where, yes, they're small independent films, but it's not just about some kind of spectacle or some kind of kill count, that kind of thing. It's the foundations on which these films are built are usually emotional, and there's some kind of emotional damage in there, which, from a writing point of view, there's always something there to work with. So there's that you can latch onto a character idea and build a motif, and from a motif you can then build that into cues, and you can distort that when times are tough, and you can, depending on what the scene calls for. But as you also said, I mean, there are so many different branches to the horror tree. So we have like folk horror and cosmic horror, and Easter Killing is more of a whodunit kind of slasher film. But I had a long conversation with the director at the start of that, where we were able to discuss supernatural horror that we really like, films like It Follows and Sinister. And I brought in, as a reference, Censor, which is a film that just came out this year, which has got an incredible score. And just using all these other touchstones of what are called synth scores, but basically making scores which don't use band and don't use orchestra, just using electronic instruments. And it's really amazing to be able to, within the broad church of horror, to be able to walk down, then quite a long way down these separate avenues and create, I think over, the course of 8 films, like really quite eclectic scores for films which are broadly speaking horror. But when you dig into them, there's a lot of difference between each and every film. It's not just about kills and stabbing and blood and gore and jump scares. They're not that kind of party. There's something else going on, which is great from my point of view.
But I think even horror films that seem really straightforward, just pure blood and gut slashers. You take and I'll preface this, and anyone can send me hate mail if they want. I'm not a big fan of the Friday the 13th movies, but even the first one, which was thrown together really quick to just follow the trend of these slashers, even that still has an emotional core of this boy's neglected and he dies, and then the vengeance that's being wrought from it. And it's still, it's not super subtle. It's not really deep, but I think almost every horror film has that, or at least needs that. And that's something that, I think when a lot of people look down on horror, they're neglecting that aspect of it, that these films all have something more going on. They have.
I agree. And I think it's their loss as well, because I think horror at the moment is in such rude health. There are so many great films around right now and in the past few years that could be, again, using the word broad, but broadly called horror films. But I think the horror community and people who are fans of horror movies they're very open to not just being presented with experimental visuals, either overtly or subvertly, but the score as well, I think is it doesn't have to be just, psycho strings or that kind of thing. I think that the films allow composers to experiment and take huge leaps of faith and just dig a little deeper into atmosphere and emotion, rather than just this is a straight, and this is not to denigrate any other kind of genre of film, because everything needs something to help paint the picture. But it's not, you're not doing straight drama, or you're not doing straight superhero action kind of thing. There's always, you can dig a little deeper and you can add layers, I think. And I believe that the audience is receptive to what might be perceived as a slightly left of center or left field score. And I actually think that horror is kind of leading the way and bleeding out into other genres and more mainstream genres, where composers are now feeling empowered to layer up more and more. I guess some people, they would create themselves or layer up ideas that are slightly out of left field that would take them away from just like, okay, so I've got my template. What are the woodwinds going to be doing in this part of the film? They're moving away from that, and hopefully, it's to the larger benefit of film soundtracks and scoring in general. That if there's more, if there's a bigger playing field and there's more people on the field doing interesting things, then I think it's only to the benefit of the art form at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, and to take a step back, I realized I shouldn't have said anything about Friday the 13th. I forgot you have the hockey mask right behind you.
Yeah, yeah, Jason Keaton Company.
But no, I totally agree, and I think too, where I mean, horror broadly tends to be a lower budget type of film. You know, even your mainstream horror films, you know, that are going to be releasing in 4,000 theaters in the U.S. still might have a budget of $10 million or something like that, which, you know, like in the grand scheme of film isn't a lot, but you can still do a lot with that. And I think as part of that, there's, you know, it doesn't have that like studio rigidity that other films get. And so I think that gives composers a lot more flexibility. And I think as film scores become more popular and one more way to differentiate your film, that then kind of feeds into it, where people working on the film realize, oh, if we have something that a score that's very striking, that's gonna bring even more attention to it. I mean, and you'd mentioned Censor earlier, and I know that was, I mean, I know it's a great score. I've listened to it a few times, and that was one of the things that people talked about a lot. Was, you know, not only is it a good horror film, but it has a really interesting score. So, yeah, I think it's something that horror is very much ahead on, and that I hope, like you mentioned, is starting to bleed out into these other genres. That there's way more experimentation that you can do. That it doesn't have to be one. That film scoring isn't one style anymore.
Exactly. I mean, I agree, and I think there's so much content being created for so many platforms right now. People are the people who run these platforms are very hungry for content. So there's kind of a crush on getting this content made, but also with so much content being made, I think it's allowing filmmakers to be a little bit braver as well. And because pretty much all bases are being covered, you know, you have your action films and you have your superhero films and you have your horror films and your drama films and your romantic comedy films. And you have great series because, you know, obviously with Netflix kind of have led the way, and now it's growing where everyone has like their flagship shows and money just being poured into these, but they can be really brave and interesting about how the score is approached for those projects, because everyone to some degree wants to kind of raise their head above the crowd and just be seen or heard in a slightly different light to everyone else. And I think it's great. I mean, there's been times where scores have been like, it's got to be orchestral, it's got to be a certain thing, and you can use that palette to, you know, explore wherever you want to explore. But I really believe, I know it's from a consumer point of view, it can be slightly overwhelming, but from a creative point of view, I think it's a really great space to have really interesting creative conversations about how you can potentially approach your score in an interesting way. Some scores need to be a certain way. They need to be very emotive, and certain instruments lend themselves to that. But if you have the freedom to go for it a little bit, then I strongly encourage you, if you're a composer, go for it. And if you're a consumer, then embrace it.
I think, because obviously I'm the consumer side, and so I'm a massive advocate of opening your mind, listening to all the like weird, interesting, just cutting edge stuff, because, you know, there's, like you said, there's so much out there, and I guess the consumer were really spoiled because there is so much out there, and especially from a music side of things, there's so much of it's so good, and the more that you open your mind and are open to different things, the I don't know, the more exciting the world is. I mean,
Yeah, and
you
I
know,
think sometimes along the way there will be certain stepping stones that people need to kind of examine before they learn how to get past that stepping stone. And I think to a certain degree, Michael Levy's done that twice with, first of all, Under the Skin came out and people are like, what's going on with this score? But then, I mean, I loved it as soon as I heard it. I love that film as well because it's just so kind of other. But that score, whether people liked it or not, became a talking point.
mm-hmm.
And then it happened again very recently with a score that Mica wrote for. Can you remind me of the name of that film? Because I can't remember
Was
the
it
name.
Zola?
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's a bizarre listening experience, but it's again, I do believe when something is that overtly different, it's a good thing because it creates debate and it creates conversation, and people, whether subconsciously or consciously, will start to pull on little threads of things like that score, which is just so alien, and then that's going to be brought into whatever they're working on next or they're developing next. And again, the scores as they evolve and move forward get to change and hopefully are approached from new and always interesting angles. And there's nothing wrong with classic film scoring, and that will always be there. But if there's boundaries to push and there's doors to kind of lean on, then push and lean as much as you dare, and see what happens. There's only so much pushing and leaning that I can do in 2 weeks on a film, but where I can, I have been allowed to do that, which has been great.
But I love the phrasing of that scores like Zola, for instance, almost force a re-examination of film music and what film music can do and what it can sound like, because you play that alongside a Star Wars score, and they're just two, they sit on effectively the opposite ends of a musical spectrum. And so that the fact that now we can be in a place where both of those can work as a film score, depending on the film, of course.
Isn't that amazing, though?
Yeah.
To me, that's just incredible, because you can sit down with a collaborator, a director or producer, and you could point at one end of the spectrum, as you say, like there's Zola, and at the other end is the 3 different scores for June that have just come out over the past few months. And that whole field of vision between those two, we can pick a point or many points in that spectrum and just go down those avenues and have something really, really interesting. You could be either end, either extreme, and do something very interesting, but never forget that there's a huge amount of color between those 2 very, very disparate places. And it's all valid. It's all valid. So just dive in and see what happens. And I think it's David Bowie said, like, when you get into the deep water where your feet just can't touch the bottom and you're slightly out of your depth, that's where interesting things really start to happen. So there's certain little quotes like that kind of pop up in the back of my mind when I'm starting a new project, and whether the people I've collaborated with have been open to that is that's another thing. But I think it's a really powerful tool, just to, because it's important to me as a composer and as a musician, as an artist, to push myself as well. Like, I know that on every single project I learn as much about the process as I do about myself through the process. So I'm learning and I'm evolving and I'm growing, and just remembering things like that and various other things that I beat myself up over when I'm working on scores or starting on scores. I always hope to finish a score a better composer than when I began the score. And that can be just like tiny little increments, but all those increments, they all come together and they just make you better at what you do, and a better collaborator and a better composer.
I love that. I mean, that's, in my opinion, what everyone should be striving to do. Every composer doesn't have to be experimenting and pushing the boundaries of music, but to be pushing themselves, or whether you're a composer or writer in your day job, whatever, but consistently pushing to get better and to see what more you can do. I love that. It's such a good mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you're open to that, you're always going to be open to evolving. Like, I can't understand why you would possibly sort of think, well, I kind of know everything I need to know to do this job, when it's a job that's so open-ended. And I'm not suggesting there's lots of people who have that kind of frame of mind. I mean, I just know that I don't. And I love to, whether it's at the start of a project, maybe being asked to watch a film I've never watched before as a reference, just to kind of fuel the tank a little bit and kind of nudge me in a certain direction, or the way I've managed my time, or the way I've evolved. I don't work with templates, but I set up a new project because I want the film to tell me how it's going to sound, rather than like I have my huge, amazing template set up and I'm going to kind of like apply all my parts of the orchestra to. No, it doesn't work like that. Like, I want the film to express to me when I watch it what kind of sonic road, based on the film and my conversations with the people who made it, what kind of sonic road we're going to go down. So like whether it's something I've learned about how to set that up, or how I manage my time, or how I export all my work at the back end, whatever it may be, I just want there to be something new or something fresh that I've taken away from the process that I will then feed into the beginning of the next process and make that all the more worthwhile, and well, it's all worthwhile, but all the more fluid. And I don't know how to finish off that thought. I'm just always like, I love turning up. I love turning up and doing the work. And I want to make sure that when I get to the next job, I'm doing the best job I can that day, the day after, and I can take that into the next project and present myself as an even better composer that I was on the film, where they heard me and they wanted me to work on their film. Just gotta keep on driving down that road now.
So, I mean, on that same point then, are there, because we've talked about some of the musical genres that you've been working in so far, are there genres going forward, or styles that you hope that you have a chance to tackle, or that if they come up, you maybe have not necessarily a reservation, but a question as to how you're gonna hit it?
Yeah, no, I've obviously thought about this a lot, and I mean, I quite happily work in horror forever because it's huge and enormous, and I can, as an artist and as a composer, express myself in endless ways. But I'm about to begin work on a new short, which is super emotional, super intimate, and I've already done some preliminary work on that. So it's like felt piano and barely there violins and strings, that kind of thing. And I love that kind of, like, I listen to a lot of that kind of music, like labels like Erased Tapes, stuff like that. So that's all kind of in my wheelhouse as well. And I'm a huge science fiction fan. So any way I can stir all those horror and science fiction and drama. And I mean, I just did an action horror, which was kind of a creature feature, but it was, I don't think I can do spoilers. This is about a crocodile. And so I started this film, and I was like, I watched the film and I thought, I'm going to be really clever and like come at this from like a Predator. You must have seen Predator.
Yeah.
Just like kind of very highbrow, just minimal drums, and then like big action stabs. And like I did that for the opening, and they were like, it's great, but there has to be more, like just drums. So I just basically created a score of just layers and layers and layers and layers of drums, which is amazing because I'm a drummer anyway. So just, through the lens of horror, I found myself doing an action film, which was new and interesting because I find action like when I'm watching an action film, those cues tend to kind of bleed into one with me. So it was, I find a lot of the variation in score is usually expressed through other things other than like high action. So I was trying to approach that from a slightly fresh point of view, or as fresh as I could in a couple of weeks. Like the shorts that I did and the TV special that I did prior to Hatched was comedy. So my initial kind of foray into working to picture was all comedy. Unfortunately, like it was comedy where the music was playing straight, because I would never know how to score something with, you know, a badum tish at the end or a kind of a slide whistle kind of approach to film scoring. So that's something you know, I'm more than happy to do comedy, but I would never be able to come at it from we're scoring, you know, almost like an old cartoon kind of, Mickey Mouse scoring. But yeah, I mean, I'm anything that's presented to me, I'll talk about and be happy to dive in. I mean, I really, really want to. I would love to do something that's based in the desert, just because it's super evocative to me, and I want to do a score that I'm basically off the grid of my computer and everything's recorded. Everything would be recorded in the room acoustically, and then perhaps processed later on in the studio. But initially, all the germs of the ideas come from an acoustic space. Because I love cinematography and I love responding to landscape and space and atmosphere and emotion, and having a bit of time to kind of explore those tones and timbres in a physical space before kind of getting onto the grid and matching it to picture. But yeah, I mean, I've even in the work I've done, like being super precise with a pure synth score as well, and then something a bit less precise with Spider from the Attic, which was the cosmic horror. I've been able to. I feel quite fortunate to be able to. I've been kind of all over the map, but I'm terrified of animation. If you're looking for something that I don't want to do, I'm like I think that kind of wall to wall. I don't watch a lot of animation, and that to me is a terrifying concept. So but everything else, though, like if there's someone who's about to write me an email who's doing an amazing high budget animation film, please still write to me. But yeah, I don't know. There seems to be a whole other kind of philosophy of composition behind that sort of work, which I don't know, it'd be amazing to dive into that, I think. But yeah, there's some other things I would like to explore along the way for sure.
But I think even that is selling animation short. You know, it's not all like Looney Tunes kid stuff. You know, like you take Cowboy Bebop, the anime series, like that has this just really cool, stylish jazz score.
Right.
And so, or even a recent one was I can't remember the full name, but you know, Netflix released a Witcher animated film, which just has a more like kind of epic medieval fantasy sound to it. So even those, you know, they're like animation. I think is growing more and more, and maybe it's always been like that. I don't know. I haven't been a big animation or anime guy either.
Yeah,
it's a massive world too.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, when someone says animation to me, like my brain instantly sort of goes to Pixar.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, I watched the series on Netflix called Love, Death and Robots, which is a series of shorts. I think Tom Holkenberg did one of those, and those are great. I mean, and it's kind of it's like opening the toolbox and in a very short period of time and seeing, like, throwing a bunch of ideas at the screen, and they're generally sort of high concept and just super awesome. And then I did actually watch, there was a Transformers anime on there, which I watched the whole series of, and it's like it's hugely divorced from the kind of the Michael Bay end of the Transformers spectrum. But it was reminding me a lot of video games and that kind of scoring and those kinds of soundtracks. So I think you're right. I think there's a lot of common ground between very sort of happening animation and where video games are going as these like open world, never ending, like the kind of the looped music that gets used on these open world games is again, that's something that's a whole other kind of conversation. But I think there's a lot of overlap between those two worlds, which would be an amazing pool to dive into.
To see that now you're
now I'm an animation composer.
There was something that you mentioned a few minutes ago in talking about particularly wanting to score something that's set in a desert, as opposed and saying that landscapes are evocative, and I do wonder. I mean, what is it about the desert as opposed to any other broader landscape? And in one sense, I agree that it has I don't know, it has a type of invocation that's different from a mountain range or forests or anything else like that.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time out in the American Southwest, and it kind of it stuck with me, and those images have kind of penetrated and evoked themselves in the music that I've written as an artist in the past, and I think it's just cinematography of vast spaces, which is usually depicted by a desert. To me, there's always music to be found there. And I've read literature that's kind of, or is entirely set in those places. And I actually wrote an album about No Country for Old Men. It wasn't supposed to be a dig on, because the film's kind of famously got no music in it. It's got like 3 tones that happen through the whole film, but I'm a huge fan of Cormac McCarthy as well, the author of the book. And I wrote that movie. Sorry, I didn't write the movie. I wrote that album last year because I just wanted to find a musical expression of what we're talking about, of like how to describe those landscapes in a way that was hopefully. I don't know if you listen to music and get kind of pictures in your head. I know that I do, and I wanted to kind of describe those pictures in a musical way. And then recently I read a book called The Thicket, which is set in turn of the century or turn of the last century, South Texas. And again, wrote some music because it's just kind of a source of inspiration where literature can describe a landscape in a way that will then spark off musical ideas in my head the same way, looking at a film or images would. And then I like to take the time to come to the studio and try and unpack that in a musical way. But I mean, the desert thing is just something I've carried with me since I kind of, I think it just cast a bit of a spell on me that's never kind of gone away. But the same is equal of science fiction and space, and that's just a grounded version of being. I think it's just being in awe. I think it's just the first time I went to the desert and could see so far and see like a thunderstorm on the distant horizon over there, and kind of like a radio telescope over there, and a mountain range over there. Growing up where I grew up, that was so alien to me that I think it happened to be the desert, but I think I was just in awe of that environment. And awe is a good place to begin from a creative standpoint, I think.
And I did actually want to talk about the No Country for Old Men album that you did, but
okay,
talking about Cormac McCarthy and like his view of the desert in some ways. Like one of my favorite novels is his Blood Meridian. And
it's my favorite book.
Yeah, and one of the things that I love about that too is it introduces a sort of magic realism in the desert, that it's already this almost alien, awing place, and he's just taken that up another notch of like strange, inexplicable things can happen here, and no one questions it because of where we are. And I love that, and I think, I don't know, so you talk about that it reignites that feeling that I have as well, that I had almost forgotten about, or at least had been dormant for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, I was just happened to be reading, I think, Blood Meridian around the same time that I did my first trip out there. As you and I were talking sort of off air before, I spent a lot of time in Texas and would road trip out from there to New Mexico and Arizona. And coming from coming from England, that is, it's like being on Mars or something. But it wasn't. There was life there, and there was communities there, and there was mysticism there, and there was mystery, and there's kind of a danger, but just such an inherent beauty to the place. And I don't think anyone has described it as well as Cormac McCarthy has in Blood Meridian. Like, he finds new ways to talk about this evolving landscape, page after page after page, certainly more eloquently than I'm doing now. So all I could do was try and write some music which processed my feelings about that environment.
So then when you have these parallel careers, let's say, of media composition, and then your own output, your own experimentations, your own just thoughts and ideas being put out individually, is there, do you ever, when you're writing one, put too much or too little of yourself in there, or want to save some of what you're creating for the other path?
No, not at all. They exist separately, and I've got really good at managing both things. I think the easiest way to describe it is, all my focus is on composition for picture, is on my I don't even like calling it my job, but it is essentially my job. And all the other music that happens will be in breaks between. And I have a compulsion to make music. And it's been that way for about 20 years now, I think. And certainly in the last 15, where I really started to kind of get into the craft of recording. I got to a point where I can actually, I've been able to, I make music relatively quickly, I suppose. And if I have time off, I'm just really crap at doing nothing. I'm terrible. And it's been a long road to get to this point of where I'm a media composer and I'm a film composer. And it's amazing because I finally am doing the thing which I feel that I was put here to do. And it's taken a long time and to get to this point. And I learned a lot of things along the way. And I walked down the artist path as well. And I did a lot of touring. And because it was underground, I was holding down a day job at the same time. And the management of time of like dual paths has been something I've been on for a while. But composition to picture is absolutely my priority. But I have this compulsion that if I have time off, I mean, like last Christmas, I had, like most people, like everywhere shuts down over Christmas and everyone sort of takes a few days off. So I was like, yeah, I'm gonna just chill. And I made a record in that time. And but that was cool because that was, and also like my artist work is kind of in itself is split into two kind of different wings. So I have like my artistic expression, which is kind of me working my stuff out and writing music. And then running concurrently with that is the stuff which is informed by what we're talking about, like film and my love of film and my love of genre. So, I mean, I made an album based on the mythology of Blair Witch. I made an album based on like an expanded universe album based on the Event Horizon. So that kind of came out of a weird situation where I heard they were making something new, and there was a bit of a pitch that happened, and I just kind of ran with it and made a record. And then the No Country for Old Men thing, that was there was a Juneteenth thing happening last year on Bandcamp, and I really wanted to have something fresh to present, and because they were putting a lot of earnings from that day towards charity. So I thought, okay, now's the time. I'm gonna make this album about this book that I love. So I made that in 4 days, and just like got in here and it's like I made a track a day, mixed it, and then it was ready to go on Friday. So there's always an idea to kind of chase up, and I like to I like to stay. It's not like staying busy. It's just like it's like going to the gym. So you come to the studio and like you have to do exercise, I believe, and I believe that, but I also enjoy the process of working through the concept of making music, and then it gives me, I'm mixing things all the time, so my mixing gets better. I'm composing all the time, so my arranging gets better, my playing gets better, and then the next film project starts, and all those fresh tools are in the kit, along with what I learned from the film I did just before I made that record as well, and that all gets pushed forward on down the road into the next thing, and I get excited by that process. I don't feel burnt out by it. I feel I get a lot of energy from that, a lot of good energy from that. Because the thing is, because I love what I do, and like I said, this is kind of what I feel like I was supposed to do. I've got to the point where I manage my time, that I keep all my touchstones with reality on a daily basis. So I do work quite a long day. I usually work from about 8 or 8:30 in the morning to about 10 o'clock at night. But within that time, around about midday, I'll take 2 hours and I'll hike, I'll have lunch, and then come back to another session, and then break for 2 hours, exercise, cook dinner, and then do another session, and then just stop, and then maybe go and watch a movie or something. And then, but like those walks that I take and that time spent outside are absolutely essential for maintaining my mental health and keeping me in touch with reality. And because you can get lost in the process, you can get lost in thought, you can trip over yourself, you can hit cul-de-sacs that you can't get out of. And I found a long time ago that walking is it's the medicine that cures every problem. If it's a mix issue, a compositional issue, sometimes just the act of standing up and putting on my boots to go, like I've already solved the problem, but I still go and do it, because being outside, interacting with the environment and seeing some sky and some trees, and I'm fortunate enough that I live just outside of the city, so I'm surrounded by countryside, and I love being able to interact with that and see some animals and some sky and some sunshine, and then come back and just be fresh to go. And I can still hit all my deliverables and still hit whatever, like if I'm saying to myself, I've got a target of 7-8 minutes to hit today, I can still do that and manage my own sanity in the process, because there's a lot of pressure on us as composers to deliver and deliver and deliver, and that's cool, and I'm cool with that. But I'm not going to like break myself in the process. I can do both. I can have a long enough day where I can deliver the work and take care of myself as well, because I think in any kind of area of work, people can quite easily fall into the trap of pursuing certain goals and neglecting themselves along the way. And we shouldn't do that. We should always make room for our own little headspace.
I would 100% agree, and I think that's I'm sure we could be talking for a while at this point. But I think that's a great place to end on, and a message to everybody, not just composers and myself included. Take care of yourselves, because it's so easy to get wrapped up and get lost and neglect the thing that is most important.
Absolutely, could not agree more, Nick.
Andy, once again, I'm so glad you could join me. Had a great time chatting, and
Thanks for having me, man.
I know
It's
that
been a joy.
we'll be talking afterwards, and I can't wait to hear all the other things that you come out with.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, of course.